I wasn't searching for giants when I began looking into Appalachian coal mining history. Instead, I was following the thread of labor organization in the years before the United Mine Workers took control of the region. Work camps, company towns, the brutal extraction economy that powered America's industrial rise. The kind of research that gives you clean columns of tonnage figures and accident reports, then moves on. Standard labor history. But then I came across the photographs. Not pamphlet illustrations, not exaggerated mountain folklore. Not what you'd expect to find in a conspiracy leaflet. Photographs. Actual photographic evidence from the 1880s to the early 1910s, showing work crews at coal tipples, shaft entrances, on the fringes of mining operations across the Appalachian Range. And among the ordinary men standing in those images, figures of impossible scale. The proportions were so extreme they first looked like perspective tricks. Except they weren't. The ground was flat. Shadows fell correctly. The tipple structures in the background gave consistent reference points across every frame. The men standing next to those structures were clearly, verifiably average-sized. And the figures standing among them were not. These images predate any sophisticated manipulation technology. They were taken with large-format glass plate cameras, by company photographers, labor investigators, survey teams hired to document mine output and workforce makeup. That's when the official story stopped holding up. The deeper I dug, the more photographs surfaced. Glass plate negatives held in West Virginia state archives. Albums and prints from federal labor investigation files compiled during the 1890s and early 1900s. Gelatin silver prints from company records once kept by now-defunct coal operators in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. In image after image, camp after camp, across the entire length of Appalachian coal fields, the same setup. Work crews of 15, 20, sometimes 30 men lined up at shift change or posing beside the day's coal. And among them, consistently, individuals standing 9, 10, sometimes 11 feet tall. Not one. Not an isolated medical oddity recorded for scientific curiosity. Multiple individuals, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single crew photo, standing with their colleagues in the gray morning light outside a mine entrance, wearing the same canvas work clothes, same heavy boots, same carbide lamps clipped to their caps. The Smithsonian has materials from the 1900 labor surveys that mention these individuals. The Library of Congress's Prints and Photographs Division holds documentation from industrial survey expeditions that swept through the region between 1895 and 1910. British coal investment firms, heavily capitalized in Appalachian operations during this period, kept meticulous photographic records of their workforce and infrastructure. And there, in those investor documentation packages sent across the Atlantic to reassure London shareholders, they appear without comment. Men of extraordinary size integrated into the labor force, unremarkable. Always the same pattern: document, catalog, never investigate. Never ask why. Why were so many concentrated specifically in coal extraction? Why do the photos cluster between 1880 and 1912, then stop abruptly? Why do labor investigator journals describe these individuals not as medical curiosities but as productive workers, especially valuable for their ability to handle deep, low-clearance seams that exhausted normal men in hours? Here's what makes the evidence impossible to dismiss. These giants aren't posed for display. They're working. Mid-shift, covered in coal dust like everyone around them. The photographs weren't taken to highlight anomalies. They documented mine operations, workforce headcounts, output verification, safety compliance, and the giants were simply there. Unremarkable enough that photographers didn't bother to explain or emphasize them. Once you notice it, the physical evidence multiplies in ways that can't be explained away. I started looking at the mining equipment itself. Standard hand drilling tools from Appalachian operations of this period run large by any reasonable comparison to contemporary tools from European mines or Western American silver and copper operations. Handles recovered from sealed sections of abandoned mines in Mingo County and Harlan County measure significantly longer than their documented European equivalents. Standard explanation: regional manufacturing variation. Except these same regions were importing large amounts of equipment directly from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati manufacturers who supplied mines nationwide. Why would identical suppliers produce dramatically different tool proportions for just one region? The evidence embedded in the tools is harder to dismiss. Grip circumferences on recovered pick handles from several Appalachian sites measure well beyond what would be ergonomically practical for a standard adult hand. Not worn down or reshaped through use, original manufacturer dimensions. A normal man gripping such a handle loses the mechanical control that makes the pick useful. The tool becomes awkward, inefficient. But for a hand proportionally scaled to a 9-foot frame, the dimensions become exactly right. The coal cars tell a related story. Narrow-gauge mine cars used for hauling coal from the working face to the shaft bottom were, in most operations, pushed by hand before mule haulage and later electric motors arrived. Recovered mine cars from several operations in the Pocahontas coal field of southern West Virginia are built to pushing height specifications that would require a man well over 7 feet tall to push with proper body mechanics, the kind of upright, hip-driven push that doesn't wreck your back over a 12-hour shift. For an average height man, the push bar height forces a bent posture that's not just uncomfortable but structurally damaging over time. Yet these cars were in daily use for decades. Museum catalogers have labeled them experimental designs or transitional technology. They're found in working mine contexts, showing years of coal dust buildup and operational wear in operations that ran these cars continuously for a decade or more. There was nothing experimental about them. Then there are the mine structures themselves. Appalachian coal operations in this period weren't mostly deep shafts. They were drift mines and slope mines, following seams into hillsides. The entries, portals, and interior heading dimensions were theoretically determined by seam height. You cut just enough rock to extract coal economically. Every extra inch of roof rock meant more blasting, more labor, more material to move. Operators were aggressively cost-conscious. Yet portal dimensions at dozens of abandoned mine sites throughout the central Appalachian coal fields are significantly larger than the coal seams they accessed would require. Documented seam heights of 4 to 5 feet, typical for the region, don't explain entry portals standing 8 to 9 feet high. The standard explanation involves ventilation requirements and equipment clearance. Except contemporary mining engineering manuals from the period specify portal dimensions well below what these sites show. And the mines were using equipment that fit those standard specs with room to spare. The surface structures are even harder to explain away. Company housing in isolated Appalachian mining camps, the structures built farthest from the main settlements, designated in company records as housing for heavy labor crews or extraction teams, consistently show architectural proportions that don't match the company housing built for the general workforce. Door frames standing 10 feet high, interior ceiling heights approaching 12 feet in structures otherwise built with absolute minimum material use, because waste in company town construction came directly out of profit margins. Sleeping platforms at heights that would leave an average man's feet dangling uncomfortably. Tables and benches at heights calibrated to someone significantly taller than the standard workforce. Not in one camp, not in two. In camp remnants documented across 5 states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, wherever the oldest and most remote mining operations left structural remains. Why would operators who squeezed every board foot of lumber, who built housing barely large enough for a man to turn around in, consistently build the heavy labor housing too large? Unless it wasn't too large for the men assigned to it. The photographic evidence, examined systematically, is devastating to conventional explanations. The scale confirmation available in these images is unusually reliable, better than in many historical photo collections because mine operations provided an abundance of fixed-dimension reference objects. Timber support sets in mine headings were manufactured to standard sizes. Coal cars were built to documented specs. The mine structures themselves had known dimensions recorded in company engineering files that survive in several state archives. When you establish scale from these reference objects and then measure the human figures in the frame, the numbers are consistent across dozens of independent images. Individuals standing 9 to 11 feet tall appear in crew photographs from operations in 5 states, spanning 3 decades, captured by different photographers using different camera equipment under different conditions. The consistency isn't what you'd get from perspective tricks. Perspective distortion isn't consistent. It varies based on camera position, focal length, distance. What you see in these images is consistent in a way that represents only one thing: people who were actually that size. Their hands are visible in many of the higher quality photographs. Hands holding pick handles, hands resting on the shoulders of standing colleagues, hands proportional to the bodies they belong to. Not deformed, not swollen, and not showing the characteristic bone thickening of acromegaly. Simply scaled. Everything in correct proportion, just fundamentally larger. And their faces, in photographs where detail permits, lack the characteristic coarsening that comes with pituitary gigantism. Normal faces, just large. The outside context comes from federal investigators who weren't looking for giants either. The labor investigations that swept through Appalachian coal country between 1900 and 1912 produced thousands of pages of testimony and observation. Most concerns wages, hours, company store debt, safety conditions. But threaded through multiple independent investigators' reports are casual references to workers of extraordinary physical size encountered at isolated operations. A 1903 Bureau of Labor Statistics field report covering operations in McDowell County, West Virginia, describes encountering a section crew in terms so clinical they clearly weren't meant to be remarkable. Several workers of unusual stature employed in the heading operations, apparently of local mountain extraction, whose physical dimensions considerably exceeded normal parameters. Foreman indicated such workers particularly effective in heavy extraction work. The 1907 Inland Steel Internal Survey of their Appalachian acquisitions, recently digitized from private records donated to an Indiana Historical Society, contains photographs of several operations with visible large-scale individuals in the workforce, captioned only with operation names and dates. No note of anything unusual. As if large men in the crews were unremarkable background detail not worth commenting on. 3 meters, 10 feet, noted clinically, then the report moves on to discuss coal quality and haulage infrastructure. As if the investigators had more pressing matters to document. Then the record stops. After around 1913, the photographs cease. Not gradually, as one era of photographic technology gives way to another. Abruptly. Mine crew photographs from the mid-1910s onward, and there are many, as photo documentation of workforce and operations actually becomes more common with the spread of smaller, cheaper cameras, show only normal-sized men. What changed? The operations didn't stop. Coal extraction in Appalachia expanded dramatically during World War I and into the 1920s. Photographic documentation became more thorough, not less. Yet the large individuals who appeared unremarkably in pre-war crew photos simply vanish from the record. The United Mine Workers organizing drives of this period provide some archival cover: labor unrest, shifting workforce composition, mechanization of some operations. But these explanations don't survive contact with the specifics. The individuals visible in photos before the cutoff didn't leave because of mechanization. The operations where they're documented continued using hand labor for years afterward. They simply stop appearing in the record. Stop being photographed. Stop being mentioned in labor reports. Stop existing in official history. British investor records show the same discontinuity. German industrial surveys of American coal resources, which included photographic documentation through 1911, simply omit what they had previously documented without comment. It isn't that later records contradict earlier ones. The later records simply behave as though there's nothing unusual to observe, while the earlier records casually document something extraordinary. As if sometime around 1912 or 1913, a collective decision was made about what was appropriate to record, what was permissible to see. The physical evidence persists in ways that can't be entirely erased. Antique dealers and mining salvage operations throughout central Appalachia still occasionally surface oversized implements. Picks with handles no normal man can swing effectively, drill steel in diameters exceeding any documented equipment specifications from the period, loading shovels with blade dimensions that would make them unmanageable for standard-sized operators. All showing where patterns of regular use. All functional tools recovered from working mine contexts, not display pieces or ceremonial objects. County historical societies catalog them as oversized specimens or unclear industrial application, despite being recovered from mine sites and bearing unmistakable evidence of mining use. Coal dust ground into wood grain that no amount of time removes, the specific wear patterns from striking rock and coal, the chemical residue from black powder used in pre-electric blasting operations. The alternative explanation, that these were everyday tools for workers whose size made such proportions practical, goes unspoken in institutional documentation. The questions such an explanation would raise are apparently too disruptive. Too many implications for what we think we know about who built the industrial foundation of American energy production. Who accomplished those feats of extraction in the years when coal powered everything? What disturbs me most isn't the evidence itself. When you present these photographs to American labor historians, they acknowledge the images are authentic, nod at the scale discrepancies, and explain them away as perspective effects, without ever explaining how perspective effects remain consistent across hundreds of images, multiple photographers, different decades, different camera technologies. When you show the tools to curators, they catalog them as manufacturing anomalies. When you describe the architectural proportions of the remote camp structures, you're told they reflect regional building practices, without any attempt to explain why those practices would consistently waste scarce material on excess height. It's not active denial. It's systematic incuriosity. Questions that aren't asked because following them to their conclusions would require rewriting narratives that are, at this point, institutional. But the questions remain. Why did individuals of extraordinary size concentrate specifically in Appalachian coal extraction during this particular historical window? Why do company records describe them as valued, specifically recruited for heavy work, rather than as curiosities or medical cases? Why does their documentation cease precisely as labor organizing and federal oversight of mine operations increase? Precisely as the workforce becomes more formally documented, more officially counted. And what happened to them? There's no record of departure. No corresponding appearance of large individuals in other regional labor forces. No demographic event that would explain the disappearance. They simply stop being recorded. I keep returning to one photograph in particular. It's undated, but contextually placed in the early 1900s, recovered from the estate of a mine foreman whose family donated a collection of operational photos to a county historical society in southwestern Virginia. The image shows a shift change at a drift mine entrance. 6 men coming out of the portal black with coal dust. All are normal size. One is not. He's not centered in the frame. Not highlighted, not positioned for emphasis. Coal dust on his face and hands like everyone else. He's simply part of the shift coming out of the mountain. But his head clears the portal entrance that the other men duck under. His hand rests on the back of the men in front of him. A casual, collegial gesture. He is not a tall man. He is a giant. And no one in the photograph is looking at him the way you'd look at something extraordinary. They're colleagues, co-workers. Just people finishing a shift. We made them impossible by pretending they never existed. We turned documented reality into forbidden speculation by simply refusing to ask the questions the documentation raised. We erased individuals who were apparently ordinary enough in their own time that the foreman who kept this photograph for the rest of his life filed it among routine operational records rather than as a specimen of the remarkable. The mountains hold what the history books don't. The tools remain in salvage yards. The oversized camp structures still stand in the hollows, slowly returning to the hillsides, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why were they there? Why were they forgotten? And what else have we agreed quietly not to see?